There's a voice that speaks constantly, and it's easy to mistake it for truth. It shows up when everything is quiet. It replays mistakes. It turns small failures into something personal. And it speaks with so much certainty that questioning it doesn't even cross your mind. Over time, it becomes familiar, and what is familiar begins to feel true. There's a moment most people know too well. Nothing is happening, and yet your mind won't stop. It brings back something you said, something you did, something you wish you could take back. And that voice doesn't just remind you, it judges you. It adds weight. It turns a simple moment into something that feels permanent. And the unsettling part is, you trust it. But the Stoics saw something different. They believed we are not disturbed by what happens, but by what we think about what happens. Which means that voice in your head isn't an authority. It's a narrator, one that can distort as easily as it can guide. And the real danger isn't that the voice exists. It's that you've never been taught how to respond to it. Think about a moment you regret. Not something dramatic, just something small and personal. Maybe you said something awkward. Maybe you delayed something important. Maybe you didn't act the way you wish you had. The moment passed, but your mind didn't. It replayed it, broke it apart, and slowly added meaning to it. What started as something simple became something heavier, something that felt like evidence, as if that one moment said something permanent about who you are, and the more you replayed it, the more convincing it became. No one else needed to criticize you because the voice in your head had already taken over, repeating the same lines with more certainty each time. At some point, it didn't even feel like a thought anymore. It felt like a conclusion, and that's where the real weight comes from. Not what happened, but what your mind decided it meant. There's something subtle happening in those moments that most people never stop to notice. Your mind isn't just remembering events, it's interpreting them, it's shaping them, and attaching meaning to them quietly. It takes something temporary and makes it feel permanent. A small mistake becomes a reflection of your intelligence. A missed opportunity becomes a reflection of your worth. A moment of hesitation becomes a reflection of your character, not because those meanings are real, but because your mind fills in the gaps automatically. And once that meaning is attached, it sticks. You don't just remember what happened, you remember what you decided it meant about you. The Stoics understood this deeply. They saw how quickly the mind moves from observation to judgment. One moment you're noticing something, the next you're defining it. And once that definition forms, it begins shaping everything that follows. Your mood shifts, your confidence drops, your actions adjust. All from a single thought that was never questioned. That's why those thoughts feel so convincing. They don't show up as possibilities, they show up as facts. The mind doesn't say, this might mean something. It says, this is what it means. And because it sounds like your own voice, you trust it without resistance. It feels natural. It feels justified. But that authority is not always earned. It's assumed. And once you start to see that clearly, something begins to change. You realize that the voice in your head is not a perfect guide, but a storyteller. One that can distort just as easily as it can clarify. Left unchecked, that storyteller builds patterns. It repeats the same interpretations over and over until they start to feel like identity. You begin to expect the same thoughts, anticipate the same judgments, and respond in the same ways. Not because reality demands it, but because repetition made it familiar, and familiarity feels like truth. But the moment you recognize that what you're hearing is interpretation, not reality, you create distance. It's small at first, almost invisible, but it changes everything. You're no longer fully inside the thought, you're observing it. And in that space, something opens up. Because once you can see a thought clearly, it loses some of its power over you. This is where a different kind of discipline begins. Not the kind that forces you to suppress thoughts or replace them with something artificial, but the kind that allows you to examine them. The Stoics never tried to silence the mind, they tried to understand it. They knew that peace doesn't come from eliminating thoughts, but from refusing to be ruled by them. And that doesn't require force, it requires awareness. Just a pause, just enough to question what you're hearing before you believe it. And if you're trying to understand your own mind in that way, not to escape it, but to see it clearly, then subscribing is a choice. A small step toward clarity, toward discipline, toward becoming someone who isn't controlled by every thought that appears. Because the way you think shapes the way you live, and learning to see your thoughts clearly might be one of the most important things you ever do. The shift is subtle, but it is powerful. Instead of immediately accepting the voice, you begin to evaluate it. Instead of reacting, you observe. Instead of identifying with every thought, you create a boundary between yourself and what your mind is producing. And over time, that boundary becomes stronger. The voice may still speak, it may still replay moments and attach meanings, but it no longer has complete authority. It becomes something you can listen to without obeying. This idea was captured simply in the reminder that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realizing this is not just a philosophical statement, it is a practical one. It means that while you cannot control what happens or what thoughts initially appear, you can control what you do with them. You can decide whether to accept them, question them, or let them pass. And that decision, repeated consistently, begins to reshape the relationship you have with your own mind. What once felt overwhelming starts to feel manageable. What once felt like truth starts to feel like possibility. And what once controlled you begins to lose its grip. Not because the voice disappeared, but because you stopped giving it unquestioned authority. You started to see it for what it is, a process, not a verdict. And in that recognition, the weight of those small moments begins to fade. They return to what they always were, temporary events, no longer carrying the burden of exaggerated meaning. Part of the answer lies in how the mind presents its thoughts. Your inner voice does not sound like a suggestion, it sounds like a conclusion. It arrives fully formed, with a tone that feels certain, final, and strangely authoritative. When it says something like, "You are not good enough," or "This will fail," it doesn't feel like a passing idea drifting through your awareness. It feels like something already decided, something already proven. And because it carries that tone, you don't naturally question it. You accept it, not because you've examined it carefully, but because it feels familiar. It sounds like you, and that resemblance alone gives it credibility. Over time, that pattern becomes automatic. A thought appears, it feels true, and you move forward as if it were a fact. There is a quiet efficiency in the way the mind works. It does not want to evaluate every thought from scratch, so it builds shortcuts. It learns to recognize patterns, to respond quickly, to conserve effort. But that efficiency comes with a cost. When the mind becomes used to presenting thoughts as conclusions, it stops distinguishing between what is accurate and what is simply habitual. A repeated thought begins to feel like a verified one, and the more often it appears, the less resistance it meets. It becomes easier to believe, not because it is correct, but because it is familiar. This is how certain ideas about yourself take root without ever being tested. They are not examined, they are absorbed. As Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Once that absorption happens, the voice in your head gains a kind of quiet authority. It doesn't need to argue its case. It doesn't need to provide evidence. It simply states, and you follow. This is why even harsh thoughts can feel justified. They arrive with the same tone as your reasonable thoughts, the same sense of certainty, the same internal voice. There is no clear distinction between guidance and distortion, because both are delivered in the same way. And without that distinction, it becomes difficult to separate what deserves your attention from what does not. Everything feels equally valid simply because it originates from within. If you slow this process down, even slightly, something begins to stand out. The tone of certainty is not proof of truth. It is just a feature of how thoughts are delivered. The mind does not label its thoughts with degrees of accuracy. It does not announce which ones are useful and which ones are misleading. It presents them all in the same voice, leaving you to decide what to do with them. And if you never pause to make that decision, you end up accepting everything by default. That acceptance becomes a habit, one that reinforces itself over time. The more you believe your thoughts automatically, the less likely you are to question them in the future. This is where a subtle shift becomes necessary, not a dramatic change, not an attempt to silence the mind, but a simple act of noticing. When a thought appears, instead of immediately stepping into it, you remain just outside of it. You observe its tone, its language, its certainty. You begin to see that the confidence it carries is not always earned. It is often assumed. And once you see that clearly, the grip it has on you begins to loosen. It does not disappear, but it becomes less convincing. It becomes something you can examine, rather than something you must obey. There is a deeper layer to this that often goes unnoticed. The mind is not only presenting thoughts, it is also reinforcing identity. When it repeats certain conclusions about you, especially negative ones, it starts to shape how you see yourself. A single thought, repeated enough times, begins to feel like a description rather than an interpretation. It moves from "this happened" to "this is who you are." And that shift is where the real damage occurs, because once a thought becomes tied to identity, it becomes much harder to challenge. It no longer feels like something external, it feels like something essential. But identity, like thought, is not fixed in the way it often appears to be. It is influenced by what you repeatedly accept as true. If you allow every harsh conclusion to define you, your sense of self will gradually reflect those conclusions. If you begin to question them, even slightly, that reflection starts to change. This is not about replacing negative thoughts with forced positivity. It is about removing the automatic belief that gives those thoughts their power. It is about creating enough space to decide whether they deserve to stay. This idea is captured in a simple reminder that it is not things themselves that disturb us, but our opinions about them. The implication is direct and practical. What you experience internally is not determined solely by what happens, but by how you interpret it. And those interpretations are not fixed. They are shaped, repeated, and reinforced through habit, which means they can also be examined and adjusted, not instantly, not without effort, but gradually, through awareness. As that awareness develops, the relationship you have with your inner voice begins to change. It no longer feels like an unquestionable authority. It becomes something closer to a tool, one that can still produce unhelpful output, but one that you are no longer forced to follow. The thoughts still appear, the tone may still carry certainty, but your response to them is no longer automatic. You begin to notice the gap between what is said and what is true, and in that gap there is choice. That choice is quiet, but it is significant. It allows you to step back instead of reacting immediately. It allows you to evaluate instead of accepting. And over time, it weakens the pattern that once felt so strong. The voice in your head does not lose its ability to speak, but it loses its ability to define you without your consent. It becomes part of your experience, not the ruler of it. And that shift, though subtle at first, changes the direction of everything that follows. As Epictetus put it, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes powerful in a very practical way. They did not try to eliminate thoughts or silence the mind, because they understood that such attempts often create more struggle. Instead, they focused on how to relate to what appears internally. They practiced examining their thoughts with a kind of calm detachment, as if they were looking at something that needed to be understood rather than something that needed to be obeyed. This approach removes urgency. It removes the feeling that every thought demands a reaction, and in that space, a different kind of clarity begins to form. You start to see that not every thought carries the same weight, even if it feels that way in the moment. When a harsh thought appears, the instinct is to respond immediately, to accept it, argue with it, or try to push it away. But the Stoic approach introduces a pause, a brief moment where you step back and consider what is actually happening. A thought has appeared, nothing more. It has not proven itself. It has not justified its presence. It has simply entered your awareness. And in that moment, you have a choice. Not about whether the thought appears, because that is often outside of your control, but about what you do with it once it does. That distinction is subtle, but it is essential. It separates what happens to you from what you participate in. This is where the question of control becomes central, not as an abstract idea, but as a practical filter. When a thought begins to pull your attention, you can quietly examine whether it relates to something you can influence. If it does not, then engaging with it only drains your energy without changing anything. If it does, then the focus shifts away from judgment and toward action. This redirection changes the role of the inner voice completely. It no longer exists to criticize or define you, but to point towards something that can be adjusted or improved. The same mental process that once trapped you in cycles of overthinking begins to guide you toward clarity and movement. This shift is not about becoming passive or indifferent. It is about becoming precise. Instead of reacting to every thought with equal intensity, you begin to allocate your attention more carefully. You start to see that some thoughts are simply noise, repetitions of old patterns that do not require engagement. Others point towards something useful, something that can be addressed through action. The challenge is not to eliminate the noise, but to recognize it for what it is. And that recognition becomes easier the more you practice observing rather than reacting. This idea is captured in the reminder that we have power over our minds, not outside events. The meaning of that becomes clearer as you begin to practice it. You cannot stop thoughts from appearing, just as you cannot control everything that happens around you. But you can decide how much authority those thoughts have. You can decide whether they are followed, examined, or simply allowed to pass. And that decision, repeated consistently, begins to reshape your internal experience. It creates a sense of control that is not based on eliminating difficulty, but on responding to it differently. As this way of thinking develops, the harshness of the inner voice begins to lose its impact. Not because the thoughts themselves become softer, but because your relationship to them changes. They no longer feel like commands. They feel like inputs, suggestions that can be accepted or rejected. The emotional weight they carry starts to diminish, because you are no longer treating them as final judgments. You are treating them as temporary events, subject to examination and change. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." Over time, this creates a noticeable shift in how you move through your day. Situations that once triggered long cycles of overthinking begin to pass more quickly. Moments that would have led to self-criticism become opportunities for adjustment instead. The mind does not become silent, but it becomes more orderly. It becomes something you can navigate rather than something that controls you. And that sense of navigation, of being able to step back and choose your direction, is where a deeper kind of confidence begins to form. It is not loud or dramatic. It does not announce itself. But it is steady. It comes from knowing that even when the voice in your head becomes harsh, you are not obligated to follow it. You can observe it, question it, and redirect your focus toward what actually matters. And in doing so, you transform the role of that voice. It stops being a source of constant judgment and becomes a tool that, when used carefully, can help you move forward with clarity instead of being held in place by doubt. The reason so many people remain stuck in that cycle is that negativity feels useful, even when it isn't. It gives the impression that you are being honest with yourself, that by pointing out your flaws and mistakes in the harshest way possible, you are somehow becoming better. There is a certain kind of comfort in that harshness, a belief that if you are strict enough with yourself, you will avoid failure, avoid embarrassment, avoid falling short again. It feels like discipline, it feels like responsibility, but underneath that feeling, something else is happening. The constant pressure, the repeated criticism, the relentless focus on what is wrong begins to slow you down rather than push you forward. What seems like effort starts to turn into resistance. The mind convinces you that this approach is necessary. It tells you that without this level of self-criticism, you would become careless, unmotivated, or indifferent. It frames harshness as a form of control, as if being hard on yourself is the only way to stay on track. And because of that, letting go of that tone can feel risky. It can feel like you are lowering your standards or giving yourself permission to fail. But if you look closely at the results, a different pattern becomes clear. Constant self-criticism does not create clarity, it creates hesitation. It fills your mind with noise, making it harder to focus on what actually needs to be done. Instead of moving forward, you get stuck analyzing, doubting, and second-guessing. This is where the distinction between correction and attack becomes important. Correction is precise. It identifies what needs to change and directs your attention toward action. It is calm, focused, and practical. Attack, on the other hand, is broad and emotional. It does not guide, it overwhelms. It does not isolate the problem, it turns the problem into something personal. Instead of saying, "This approach didn't work," it says, "You are the problem." And once that shift happens, it becomes much harder to act. Because when the issue is framed as something inherent, something tied to who you are, there is no clear path forward. There is only weight. There is a quiet shift that happens when you begin to move away from that pattern. Instead of asking how to silence the voice, you start to ask how to make it useful. That shift in perspective changes everything. It moves the focus away from control and toward function. The voice does not need to disappear, it needs to become more precise. It needs to stop speaking in generalizations and start focusing on specifics. A useful inner voice does not make broad statements about your worth or your abilities. It points to actions. It identifies what can be adjusted, what can be improved, what can be done differently next time. This kind of precision removes unnecessary emotion from the process. It does not ignore mistakes, but it does not exaggerate them either. It treats them as information rather than as evidence of failure. And that difference, though subtle, has a powerful effect on how you respond. When the focus is on action, movement becomes easier. You are no longer weighed down by judgment, you are directed by clarity. The energy that was once spent on self-criticism becomes available for something more useful, something that actually leads to progress. There is a well-known idea that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, that suffering often comes from the way the mind expands small issues into larger ones, adding layers of meaning that were never there to begin with. When your inner voice is imprecise, it does exactly that. It takes a specific situation and turns it into a general conclusion. It moves from what happened to what it means about you, and in doing so, it increases the emotional weight of the moment. But when the voice becomes precise, that expansion stops. The situation remains what it is, nothing more, nothing less, and that makes it easier to respond to. As you begin to apply this consistently, the results become noticeable. You start to act more quickly because there is less hesitation. You make adjustments without turning them into something personal. You begin to see mistakes as part of a process rather than as something that defines you. The voice in your head still speaks, but it speaks differently. It becomes more focused, more grounded, less emotional. It starts to resemble a guide rather than a critic. This does not mean that everything becomes easy. There are still moments where the old patterns return, where the voice becomes harsh again, where the tendency to criticize yourself feels automatic. But the difference is that you recognize it. You see it for what it is, a habit, not a necessity. And that recognition allows you to step back and adjust. It allows you to return to precision, to bring the focus back to what can actually be done. Over time, this approach creates a different kind of discipline, one that is not based on pressure or fear, but on clarity and direction. It allows you to hold yourself accountable without turning that accountability into something destructive. It keeps you moving even when things are not perfect, even when mistakes happen. And in that movement, you begin to see that growth does not come from being harsh with yourself, but from being clear with yourself. That clarity changes the relationship you have with your inner voice. It no longer feels like something that holds you back. It becomes something that helps you move forward. And that shift from criticism to direction is what transforms the voice from something that limits you into something that supports you, not by being softer, but by being more useful. Over time, the relationship you have with your inner voice begins to change in a way that is almost unnoticeable at first. There is no clear moment where everything suddenly feels different. Instead, it happens gradually, through small shifts in how you respond, how you observe, and how you interpret what appears in your mind. The same thoughts still come and go, the same patterns still try to repeat themselves, but something about your position in relation to them is no longer the same. You are no longer standing inside every thought, reacting to it as if it were a command. You are standing slightly outside, aware of it, able to see it without immediately becoming it, and that distance, even if it is small, begins to change everything. At first, this change feels subtle. The voice still speaks, still presents its conclusions with confidence, still tries to pull your attention in familiar directions. But now there is a pause where there wasn't one before, a moment of recognition. A quiet awareness that what you are hearing is not necessarily truth, but interpretation. That awareness creates space, and within that space, something new becomes possible. You begin to choose your response instead of falling into it automatically. You begin to see that thoughts can pass through your mind without needing to define you. And that realization, once it settles in, starts to reshape the way you experience yourself. The mind that once felt overwhelming begins to feel more structured, not because it has become silent, but because it has become something you can navigate. The noise is still there, but it no longer has the same authority. It no longer dictates your reactions in the same way. You start to recognize patterns as they appear, to see certain thoughts as repetitions rather than revelations. And when you see them clearly, they lose some of their impact. They become familiar in a different way, not as truths to follow, but as patterns to observe. This is where the idea of mastering the self begins to take on real meaning. It is not about controlling every thought or eliminating every negative impulse. It is about refusing to be ruled by them. It is about understanding that your mind will produce all kinds of content, some useful, some not, and that your role is not to accept everything it offers, but to decide what deserves your attention. That decision becomes easier over time as you become more familiar with the nature of your own thoughts. You start to see which ones lead to clarity and which ones lead to confusion, which ones move you forward and which ones keep you stuck. There is a kind of quiet confidence that grows from this process. Not the kind that comes from external validation or temporary success, but the kind that comes from knowing you can handle your own mind. You no longer feel at the mercy of every thought that appears. You know that even if the voice becomes harsh, even if old patterns resurface, you have the ability to step back and respond differently. That ability does not remove difficulty. but it changes your relationship to it. It makes it manageable. It gives you a sense of stability that does not depend on everything being perfect. As Seneca observed, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. This shift is often misunderstood. Many people believe that peace comes from silencing the mind, from reaching a point where negative thoughts no longer appear. But that is not how the mind works. Thoughts will continue to arise, just as external events will continue to happen. The real change is not in the absence of those thoughts, but in your response to them. It is in the recognition that you are not obligated to follow every thought to its conclusion. You are not required to engage with every interpretation your mind produces. You have the ability to let thoughts pass without attaching yourself to them. There is a reminder that the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. That quality is not determined by eliminating negative thoughts entirely, but by how you relate to them. It is determined by whether you accept them blindly or examine them carefully. It is determined by whether you allow them to define you or see them as temporary events within your awareness. And as you begin to take more responsibility for that relationship, the overall tone of your inner experience begins to shift. The mind becomes less of a battlefield and more of a space you can move through with awareness. You still encounter difficult thoughts, still face moments of doubt or hesitation, but they do not overwhelm you in the same way. They pass through, and you remain. You observe, and then you decide. That process becomes more natural over time, more consistent, more reliable, and with that consistency comes a deeper sense of control, not over everything that happens, but over how you respond to what happens within you. Eventually, you begin to see that the real transformation was never about changing the voice itself. It was about changing your position in relation to it. The voice can still speak, still present its interpretations, still try to guide or mislead, but it no longer has the final say. It is no longer the authority it once felt like. You are. And that shift, from being controlled by your thoughts to being able to observe and direct them, is where true change takes place. Not in silence, but in awareness. Not in elimination, but in mastery. In the end, the voice in your head was never your enemy. It was a tool you were never taught how to use. And the moment you stop obeying every thought, you start becoming someone who can actually direct their life instead of reacting to it. That's where real strength begins. Quiet, steady, and completely within your control. If this resonated with you, there's another video on your screen right now that will take this even deeper and help you build that inner clarity step by step. Stay with it.